If I err, the error is strictly on me. But if I am guided, it is by what the system reveals.
Yeah.
I mean, just sit with the sheer gravity of a public declaration like that.
That's heavy.
Right. We are talking about a leader, a reformer, stepping up to a podium, looking out at an entire society and stating, for the record, I am fundamentally flawed.
Right.
Like if anything goes wrong here, the blame begins and ends with my execution.
Yeah.
But if we succeed, if we actually find the right path, do not worship me. Look at the system.
It is, well, it's the absolute definition of intellectual honesty and leadership.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's the complete inverse of how human beings are, conditioned to view power and authority.
Oh, totally.
Because we are looking today at the socioeconomic framework of Allama Ghulam Ahmad Parvez, and specifically his analysis of Surah Saba, the 34th chapter of the Quran.
Right, which is the focus of our deep dive today.
Exactly. And Parvez built his entire analytical career on reading these texts not as like collections of mystical folklore or abstract theology.
Right, no magic, no folklore.
Yeah, right. He reads them as rigorous, structural treatises on how civilizations rise, function, and inevitably collapse.
Which is fascinating.
And he argues that this opening statement, this absolute separation of the leader's ego from the guiding law, it's not some poetic display of humility.
Yeah, it's not just a PR move.
No. It is a structural necessity for any rational society to survive.
Well, so to set the table for you today, the mission of this deep dive is to understand the mechanics of that rise and fall through Parvez's rationalist lens.
Yeah.
We're exploring a worldview where consequence is a mathematical certainty, not, an arbitrary punishment.
Exactly.
And that starts right at the top with this concept of leadership. Because usually in your workplace, in politics, in history, we see the exact opposite model.
Oh, yeah, the complete opposite.
Right. We see leaders who privatize success and socialize failure.
Yeah, that's the classic move.
I mean, if the economy booms, the leader points to their own genius. If the company goes bankrupt, they blame the market or unprecedented headwinds or...
The previous administration.
Yes, exactly. The previous administration. The ego is fused to the success and divorced from the failure.
Right.
But Parvez is pointing out that this text demands the inverse.
Yeah.
The ego must be completely removed from the message.
Which is an incredibly dangerous maneuver for a charismatic leader to execute if their primary goal is merely to maintain their grip on power.
Right.
Historically, leaders, especially ideological or revolutionary figures, have relied heavily on an aura of infallibility.
They need to be perfect.
Yeah, they construct this image that they are, the phrase Parvez highlights is Fawq al-Bashar.
Fawq al-Bashar.
Right, which means above human.
Wow.
They present themselves as operating on a plane that the average citizen just, cannot access or critique.
They don't walk through the markets. They don't face supply chain issues. They don't suffer the consequences of bad policy.
Nope.
They're placed on this impossible pedestal.
And Parvez argues that the very moment a society elevates a leader to that infallible superhuman status, the socioeconomic system begins to decay.
Because you can't question them.
Exactly. The logic is straightforward. If the leader is perfect, their decisions cannot be audited.
Right.
You cannot subject their policies to a stress test. You cannot hold them accountable for resource mismanagement.
Yeah, because they're above it all.
But even more dangerously, it changes the psychology of the followers.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. How so?
Well, if you believe your leader is superhuman, you are let off the hook.
Oh, I see.
You can simply say, well, we can't possibly emulate them. They have divine foresight. We are just flawed citizens.
So it's an excuse.
Yes. It becomes an institutional excuse for societal stagnation.
Like, think about a scientist in a laboratory, strictly adhering to the scientific method.
Okay, yeah.
If that scientist sets up an experiment, miscalculates the reagents, and the beaker shatters, they do not blame the fundamental laws of chemistry.
Right, they don't say chemistry is broken.
Exactly. They don't claim thermodynamics has failed. They state, I mismanaged the variables, the error is on my execution.
And conversely, if the experiment synthesizes a life-saving compound, the scientist doesn't claim to possess magical reality-bending powers.
Right. They don't say, I am a wizard.
Right. They credit the immutable laws of physics and chemistry. They recognize themselves merely as the facilitator of an objective system.
So when a reformer adopts that exact scientific mindset, it shifts the entire foundation of the society from a personality cult to the rule of law.
Yes.
It means the system is supreme. The Constitution, the framework, the revelation, it is objective.
And the human beings implementing it, from the head of state to the person sweeping the streets, are entirely subject to it.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And Parwes emphasizes how the source text repeatedly hammers home that the reformer is just a human, a bashar.
Just a normal person.
Yeah, they walk in the markets, they have families, they make tactical errors in administration.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Parwes notes that the text even preserves historical instances where the reformer made a misjudgment in policy and the system publicly corrected him.
See, most movements would immediately bury the leader's mistake.
Oh, cover it up right away.
Yeah, just to protect the brand equity of the revolution. I mean, broadcasting the error seems counterintuitive to building authority.
Well, it is counterintuitive if your authority is based on personality.
Right.
But if your authority is based on the law, broadcasting the mistake proves that the leader is subordinate to the system.
Oh, wow. So the system wins.
Right. Parwes argues this is the only way a socioeconomic structure can outlive its founders.
Because leaders die.
Exactly. Leaders die. Leaders succumb to fatigue, to bias. If your societal stability is tied to the infallibility of a single person, your society collapses the moment that person shows a flaw or passes away.
But if the system is objective, it endures the transition of power.
Yes.
Which, puts a massive, uncompromising burden on you, the citizen.
Oh, absolutely.
If the leader is constantly pointing to the system and demanding that you look at the law rather than their ego, you can't just be a passive spectator cheering for a charismatic figurehead.
You can't just sit back.
Right, you have to actually understand the mechanics of the system yourself. It demands a highly literate, critically thinking populace.
It demands active participation in a shared objective framework.
Yeah.
And to truly understand what happens when a society either accepts or rejects that participation, Parwes focuses heavily on the contrast presented in the text between two distinct civilizations.
The working civilization of David and the entitled civilization of Saba.
Exactly. This comparison is the socio-economic engine of his entire argument.
Well, let's dig into that contrast, because this is where Parwes' reading shifts from political theory into hard economics.
Yeah, let's do it.
The text introduces David, or Dawood, not as a mythical king singing psalms on a hill, but essentially as an industrialist.
Right, an engineer of statecraft.
Yeah.
Parwes pays very close attention to the specific language used to describe David's era. The text explicitly mentions the utilization of natural resources, specifically iron.
Iron.
It talks about softening iron and commanding David to make full coats of mail and calculate precisely the links.
Calculate precisely the lengths.
Yes. Parwes does not read this as a mere historical footnote about ancient blacksmithing.
Right.
He reads it as a metaphor for industrial precision, defensive capability, and a proactive, labor-driven economy.
Calculate precisely the links. I mean, that is a directive for quality control.
Exactly.
It's a mandate for systemic interdependency. A coat of mail only protects the wearer if every single link is forged correctly and connected to the next.
One link is weak.
The whole armor fails.
Right.
Parwes is seeing this as a blueprint for a functioning society.
That is the core of a working civilization. The society under David is depicted as one where resources are extracted, refined through human labor, and utilized to create security and infrastructure.
Everyone's involved.
Yeah, it's an economy based on production and meticulous systemic maintenance. Everyone has a role in forging the links. It is resilient because it is constantly being worked on.
And then the text pivots to Saba or Sheba.
Yeah.
And the contrast is just stark. Saba is not depicted as a society forging iron or calculating links.
Not at all.
They are depicted as a society that inherited massive geographical and infrastructural wealth. Specifically, like a highly lucrative position on the global trade routes and a massive agricultural system sustained by a great dam.
The Marib Dam.
Right.
Saba was a hub of transit and agriculture. They had the two gardens representing immense natural abundance and economic prosperity.
Right.
But Parwes analyzes what happens to a society when prosperity is no longer tied to the rigorous shared labor of forging the links, but instead becomes a matter of entitlement and rent-seeking.
Well, let's unpack the socioeconomic mechanics of that entitlement, because Saba didn't fall because of a random natural disaster.
Right, it wasn't just bad luck.
Exactly. According to Parwes' reading of the text, they fell because of late-stage monopolization.
Yeah.
The text mentions that they possessed these easily visible, secure transit points for trade, but the elites of Saba prayed to have the distances between their journeys lengthened.
This is one of Parwes' most fascinating economic deductions.
It's so weird. Why would a wealthy trading hub ask for longer, more difficult journeys?
Right. It doesn't make sense on the surface.
Hmm.
But Parwes interprets this as a desire by the ultra-wealthy elites to monopolize the trade routes.
Ah, okay.
The visible villages, or small, secure transit stops, represented a decentralized economy. Wealth was distributed among many smaller communities along the route.
Okay, so a thriving middle class, basically.
Exactly. The elites of Saba wanted to eliminate those smaller stops.
Oh.
They wanted to stretch the distances so that only massive, heavily capitalized caravans could make the journey, effectively wiping out the middle class and consolidating all the wealth and power into the hands of a few monopolies.
It's the ancient equivalent of a megacorporation aggressively undercutting local businesses to destroy the supply chain diversity,
Yes,
just ensuring that everyone has to buy from them.
exactly.
But the fatal flaw in that strategy is that by hollowing out the middle class and dismantling the very communities that maintain the trade routes, you are destroying your own infrastructure.
And that is exactly how Parwes reads the breaking of the dam.
Oh, the dam breaks.
Yeah. The text says the flood of the dam was unleashed upon them, replacing their lush gardens with bitter, thorny harvests.
Wow.
Parwes argues this isn't a miraculous punishment from the sky. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of an entitled, monopolistic society neglecting its foundational infrastructure.
Because no one is maintaining it.
Right. When you concentrate all the wealth at the top and eliminate the working class that actually maintains the system, the dam, both literally and metaphorically, will eventually crack and wash you away.
They stopped calculating the links.
Exactly.
They just assumed the system would just run itself forever based purely on their past glory and geographic luck. And when the dam finally broke, it was a systemic collapse born of their own greed.
Which brings us to the most terrifying phase of Parwes' analysis.
Okay.
What happens when a society completely dismisses the system, actively dismantling the laws that sustain prosperity, and the window for course correction closes?
The point of no return.
Yeah. The text describes this moment using a phrase that Parwes views as central to the mechanics of collapse. It says they are seized from a place too close to escape.
Seized from a place too close to escape. It implies this sudden, inescapable claustrophobia.
Yeah.
Like the consequences are suddenly inside the house.
Parwes is adamant that we strip away any supernatural horror from this imagery.
Okay.
To him, this is the mechanical closing of a systemic window. It is a historical deadline. Systems, whether they're ecosystems, economic markets, or political institutions, possess elasticity.
So they can stretch.
Right. You can print money recklessly without triggering immediate hyperinflation.
Yeah.
You can neglect your bridges without them collapsing the next day. You can hollow out your justice system without society immediately descending into anarchy. The system gives you a grace period.
A buffer zone where the reformer can stand up, point out the error, and initiate a course correction.
But that elasticity is strictly
Finite.
Parwes emphasizes that there are mathematical and historical thresholds. Once a society crosses that specific threshold, the chain reaction of cause and effect has advanced too far.
It's too late.
Right, corrective action is no longer structurally possible. When the text says they are seized, it means the natural, logical consequences of their own accumulated actions have matured. The bill has come due, and the account is empty.
Well, I have to push back on Parwes here regarding this strict mechanical timeline.
Okay, go ahead.
Because when I look at history, I see highly corrupt, structurally rotting societies that seem to defy this deadline for centuries.
Sure.
Like, look at the Roman Empire. The systemic rot, the political corruption, the overexpansion was visible for hundreds of years. The window seemed to stay open perpetually.
Yeah, that's a common observation.
Or look at modern petrostates that survive massive internal corruption simply because they sit on an ocean of valuable resources.
Right.
How does his mechanical threshold account for systems that seem to endlessly cheat the deadline?
It's a crucial challenge. Parwes would answer that by defining what the buffer is actually made of.
Okay.
In the case of Rome or a petrostate, the elasticity is heavily subsidized by accumulated wealth, geographic advantages, or the exploitation of external colonies.
So they have deep pockets to burn through.
Exactly. The systemic rot is absolutely happening, but the society is burning through its massive savings account to mask the decay.
Wow.
The system isn't cheating the deadline, it is just taking longer to burn through the structural capital.
So the disease is progressing, but the patient is on incredibly expensive life support.
And Parwez's point is that the life support eventually runs out.
Right.
The threshold is reached when the accumulated rot exceeds the society's capacity to subsidize it. And the tragedy of human psychology, which brings us back to the phrase seized from a place too close, is that societies interpret that long buffer period as immunity.
Oh, they think they're invincible.
Yeah. They see the life support working and assume the disease isn't real.
It's the psychology of willful blindness.
Yes.
Like, you build a city below sea level. The structural engineers hand you the data showing the levees are deteriorating. But because the levee hasn't broken yet, you assume the laws of fluid dynamics just, don't apply to your city.
Exactly.
You don't panic when the water's in the ocean. You don't panic when it breaks the levee. You only panic when the water is pooling around your ankles in your own living room.
Right.
The threat didn't teleport there. It was a long, highly observable process. But you willfully ignored it until it was too close to escape.
That is the exact socioeconomic mechanic Parwez is highlighting. The consequences were always approaching at a predictable rate.
Yeah.
The society just refused to look at the ledger. And when that threshold is finally crossed, when the water is in the living room, it triggers a predictable yet entirely useless human reaction.
The panic response.
A panic response.
Because the source text says that at the moment of the collapse, the deniers suddenly cry out, "We believe in it now."
Right.
They scream that they accept the system. They believe in the law. But the text coldly states they are reaching for this belief from a position too distant.
Parwez makes a profound structural point here about the nature of conviction.
Okay.
In his rationalist framework, conviction only possesses value when it functions as an operational engine to shape real-world action.
So it has to do something.
Exactly. Believing something while the roof is actively caving in on your head changes absolutely nothing structurally.
It has zero operational utility.
Zero.
I mean, think about dealing with corporate compliance or even something as personal as health. If your doctor tells you the system requires you to change your diet or you will have a heart attack, and you ignore them for 20 years.
Right.
The moment the artery blocks and the heart attack begins, screaming, "I believe in eating vegetables," does not clear the artery.
No, it doesn't.
The realization is correct, but the timing makes it structurally irrelevant.
Parwez points to a very specific historical example from the broader textual narrative to illustrate this, and it's the story of the pharaoh.
Oh.
As Pharaoh is actively pursuing his victims and the waters of the sea collapse back in upon him, the text records that in the literal moment of his drowning, Pharaoh cries out, "I believe that there is no deity except that in whom the children of Israel believe."
He proclaims total alignment with the right system while choking on salt water.
Yes. And his sudden faith is entirely rejected.
Interesting.
Not because the system is vindictive or petty, but because Parwez analyzes the psychology of that moment. Pharaoh's belief was not a genuine structural alignment with the principles of justice or equity.
No, of course not.
It was a biological survival reflex driven purely by the fear of immediate consequence.
It wasn't a realization of the error. It was just regret at being caught by the physics of the water.
Exactly.
If he had somehow survived that wave, he would have marched right back to his throne and continued his tyranny.
Oh, 100%.
His core character hadn't shifted. He was just frantically pulling every lever available because the ground was rushing up to meet him.
Parwez argues that true conviction is proactive. It is the capital you invest to build the infrastructure, to calculate the links, to honor the laws of cause and effect, long before the stress test arrives.
Right.
When you only acknowledge the law because it is currently crushing the breath out of you, you are merely acknowledging reality when all other options have been exhausted.
It's the timing. The universe, in Parwez's reading, operates on an unforgiving timeline.
Very unforgiving.
If you spend the entire spring and summer mocking the concept of agriculture, you cannot suddenly declare your deep, abiding belief in farming when the winter blizzards hit and your silos are empty.
Nope.
Your newfound belief in the system of agriculture cannot retroactively grow wheat in frozen soil.
The timing is the ultimate arbiter, and because their sudden realization lacks any operational value, they are left to face the permanent reality of the choices they accumulated during the buffer period.
The consequences.
Yeah. Which brings us to the final, haunting conclusion of this surah, and perhaps Parwez's most nuanced psychological insight.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text states that a firm barrier is placed between these people and everything they crave, exactly as happened to previous generations who lived in disquieting doubt.
Disquieting doubt. We have to dismantle the imagery of this barrier, because the instinct is to picture A giant sci-fi force field dropping from the sky,
Yeah, locking the society out.
locking the society out of prosperity as a form of divine punishment.
Right, but Parwes completely rejects the force field interpretation.
Right.
The barrier is not a magical wall imposed from the outside. The barrier represents the lawful socioeconomic distance a society has meticulously created between itself and prosperity.
So we got it.
Yes. When a society actively dismantles its educational institutions, when it corrupts its justice system to favor the wealthy, when it erodes social trust through polarization, it is laying the bricks of its own barrier.
You are cut off from the very things you desire. Innovation, stability, peace, not by an arbitrary punishment, but by the mathematical sum of your own choices.
Right.
You spent decades blowing up the bridges, and now you are standing on the edge of the chasm, craving the resources on the other side, weeping about a barrier.
Yeah,
The barrier is the empty space where the bridge used to be.
that's a great way to put it. And Parwes dives deeply into the linguistics of the text to explain how a society convinces itself to blow up its own bridges.
Okay.
He focuses on that phrase, disquieting doubt. In the Arabic text, he points out a profound distinction between two words that English translations often lump together as simply doubt, shak and raib.
Shak and Rabe. Let's get into this linguistic breakdown. How does Parwes differentiate Shak and Rabe, and why does it matter to the socioeconomic collapse?
Shak is a state of mere intellectual uncertainty. It is an informational deficit.
Okay, so just not knowing something.
Right. If I ask you about the specific tax code of a country you've never visited, you might say, I doubt I could explain it. I don't have the data. That is shak. It is a neutral state. It doesn't disturb your sleep. If someone hands you a book on the tax code, your shak is resolved. You read the data, you update your understanding, and you move forward.
It's a gap in knowledge waiting to be filled. So if Shak is neutral, informational doubt, what is Rabe?
Rabe is a deeply prejudiced, emotionally driven, disquieting doubt.
Prejudiced.
Yes. It is not a lack of data. It is an active psychological hostility toward the truth. It is a disturbance in the heart.
Wow.
Parwes argues that the societies that collapse like Saba do not fall because they lack information. The reformer was standing right there showing them the data.
They had the data.
The structural engineers were showing them the cracks in the dam. But the society harbored rape. They had a vested interest, a financial incentive, or an emotional bias that made them actively fight against the systemic data.
You see this dynamic constantly.
Oh, everywhere.
People don't just say, I'm not sure if this new system of equitable wealth distribution works. Let me look at the spreadsheets.
Right, they don't do that.
They say, I despise this system because it threatens my current monopoly on power. Therefore, I refuse to believe the math, and I will actively fund campaigns to undermine it.
Exactly. Rabe is the weaponization of doubt. It is a psychological fortress you build to protect your ego or your status quo.
That is so true.
Parwes notes that when a society allows Shak to metastasize into Rabe, they lose the capacity to hear reason.
They're deaf to it.
You can present a leadership team infected with Rabe with all the economic forecasting, all the climate data, all the sociological metrics in the world, and it will not move the needle.
Not an inch.
Because they are not looking for data to inform their decisions. They're looking for validation of their existing prejudices.
And if they can't find validation, they will manufacture doubt to protect their position.
Exactly.
So the barrier that ultimately cuts them off from everything they crave isn't just the result of a few bad policy choices. The barrier is cemented by their own rabe. They became so emotionally and financially hostile to the very concept of systemic reform that they seal themselves inside the architecture of their own collapse.
This is why Parwes stresses that any true reformer must tackle the rabe before they can implement the system.
Oh, that makes sense.
If you try to explain the mechanics of a new system to a populace whose hearts are full of defensive hostility, the brain simply will not process the data.
They just reject it outright.
Yeah. The tragedy of Saba and the generations before them is that they allowed their rabe to dictate their policies until the timeline expired. They lived in disquieting doubt, paralyzed by their own biases, right up until the deadline arrived.
It completely reframes how you look at the world.
It really does.
You look at failing industries, polarized nations, or even stagnant organizations,
Yeah.
and you realize they aren't suffering from a lack of information. They are suffering from rabe operating at scale. They are laying the bricks for their own barrier, day by day, assuming that if the pain ever gets truly unbearable, they'll just change their minds at the last second and the system will grant them an extension.
And as Parwez's reading has shown us, banking on that retroactive faith is mathematically useless.
The insurance office is closed. The ground is already open.
The ledger is balanced.
Well, let's synthesize all of this. Bringing Parwez's reading of Surah Saba full circle changes everything about how we interact with this text.
It changes the whole paradigm.
We didn't start with a mystical story about ancient kings and magical punishments. We started with the bedrock physics of leadership.
Yeah.
Total, unyielding ownership.
Yes.
The reformer standing up and saying, if I err, the error is strictly on me. If I am guided, it is by what the system reveals. It established an inescapable ledger of accountability and stripped away the poisonous illusion of the infallible leader.
And from that preamble, Parwez demonstrated how the Surah walks us through a complete socioeconomic stress test. It contrasts the working, proactive civilization of David, calculating the links, building the infrastructure against the entitled, rent-seeking civilization of Saba, who destroyed their own Saprochains out of greed.
Right.
It lays out the hard mechanical arithmetic of cause and effect.
It is a mechanical arithmetic. It proves that consequence is an objective, lawful process.
Absolutely.
You cannot hide behind the charisma of a leader, and you cannot bargain with a timeline of collapse. The window for actual structural reform is real, it is available, but it is strictly finite.
Strictly finite.
Guidance is an open door, a system you can adopt and utilize until suddenly mechanically it is not.
The door closes. The barrier, built by the society's own prejudice choices, is finally set in place.
Yeah.
And once the physical reality of that barrier is established, no amount of panicked last-minute belief will dissolve it. The system does not care about the intensity of your fear. It only cares about the reality of your actions during the time you were given.
So if you're listening to this, look at the systems you are navigating right now. Look at your workplace, your community, your own personal ledger. Are you actively participating in the hard labor of course correction? Well, the window is still open. Are you calculating the links, looking objectively at the flaws and building the infrastructure? Or are you living in that disquieting doubt, ignoring the structural cracks and secretly banking on a frantic I believe at the last possible second? So the fundamental lesson of Parwez's reading is this. The law of consequences does not grant extensions,